So now you have all the 3 points of the exposure triangle. And keep in mind, what we're trying to do is balance each side of the exposure, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, in order to get a well-balanced exposure. Now for the purpose of this, because I called the ISO the weapon of last resort, we don't want to touch that. We want to keep it as low as possible. So let's think about the balancing of the triangle in shutter speed and aperture terms. And let's make this about more light versus less light. So you can't just have a very slow shutter speed, meaning we're letting a lot of light in, and then have a really big aperture opening because we're flooding the camera with light. We have to balance those two. At the same token, on the other side, we can't have a very fast shutter speed, meaning we're not letting a lot of light in, and then a very tiny aperture opening where we're not letting any light in either. So how do we balance those things? Well, if I want to shoot, say, a portrait and have that beautiful blur, and I shoot with a very wide opening at, say, 2.8. Now I've got a big opening, I'm letting a lot of light in, right? Now, how do I balance that against the shutter? Well, I make it faster, right? I cut off some of that, the amount of time that the light is hitting or passing through that opening so that I balance out the exposure. Opposite way, I'm shooting a very, very tight aperture opening. I'm trying to get everything in focus, so I'm not letting a lot of light in through the opening. So I need to let more time for light to pass through that opening by shooting with a slower shutter speed. Now, the way that ISO will interact with these is sometimes you're going to be in a low light situation, for instance, where you have to shoot with a very wide aperture and a somewhat slow shutter speed, and that still might not give you what you need in order to capture the image with enough light. So you might have to tweak that ISO up in order to let more light in the camera. The goal is for all three things to be in balance. Everything's got to be in balance and in harmony in order to get the great and perfect exposure. So how do you know if you're getting the right exposure? What you want to do is you're going to pick up your camera, turn it on, and you're going to pick something to take a picture of. You're going to look through the viewfinder, find that thing that you want to take a picture of, and then half press the shutter button. What happens is a bar is going to pop up along the bottom of the viewfinder, and you're going to see a little arrow, and it's going to go left and right depending on what you point your camera and focus on. Now, if it goes to the left, into the negative territory, that means your settings are tuned so that the camera is going to shoot something dark. If the arrow goes to the right of the middle area, that means your camera settings are showing that it's going to be a bright image. What you want to do is play a game where we get the arrow in the middle so that you have a balanced exposure. So let's use one example of how you're going to use this light meter to get the picture you want. So say I'm taking that portrait of my friend right across from me, and I've decided, because I want that really nice shallow depth of field and that blur behind him or her, that I'm going to shoot with like a 2.8, the max aperture available on my lens. So I put the lens on, I'm shooting, I have it on 2.8, my ISO's at 100 where I want to keep it low as possible. And like I said before, you're going to half press when you find your focal point, you're going to half press this. That allows your camera to start the metering mode. Now you're going to keep it half pressed as you keep it on your subject. And it's going to show you, am I in the negative, am I in the plus side, and it's going to give you a good base for which way you need to go. Now, if I've decided that my aperture is going to stay at 2.8 and the meter is showing me that I'm too bright, what do I do next? Well, I'm going to take my finger off the shutter and I'm going to use the shutter wheel to make my shutter speed faster, meaning less light, right? Because right now I'm too bright, so I need to cut off some of that light. Now, the opposite is true. If I'm shooting 2.8 and it's showing me that I don't have enough light, then I'm going to try to slow my shutter speed down. I'm going to try to make that arrow go from the right to the middle or the left to the middle. And I'm going to do that using the shutter speed because because I've picked what aperture I want. Now, there are some cases where it's going to get too slow on the shutter speed where I can't handhold this and I'm going to be subject to camera shake like we talked about before. Now, if I have a 2.8 and I can't go any wider on my aperture and I'm at, say, 1/200 and I can't go any slower with my shutter speed because I'm worried there's going to be some motion shake in my picture, then the last thing I can do is my weapon of last resort, right? I can grab my ISO and I can change that now to move the arrow back towards the middle. So think about this. We're keeping everything in harmony. We pick where we want to start off with, whether that be aperture or shutter speed, and then we manipulate the other factors, ISO being the last one we touch, in order to get that arrow from the left or the right back into the center.